Picture yourself sitting beside someone you love in a quiet room in the last weeks of their life. Their breathing changes in a way you don't recognize. They stop wanting food, even the meal you spent an hour making because it used to be their favorite. Their hands feel cooler than they did yesterday. And you sit there holding one of those hands with a question you're almost afraid to ask out loud to anyone because it feels disloyal even to think it. Is this normal, or is something wrong that we should be fixing right now? Nobody tells you the answer to that question in advance, not because it's a secret, because almost nobody sits families down calmly before it happens and explains what the body actually does in its final weeks, days, and hours. Doctors are trained, quite rightly, to treat illness. Very few of them are given the time or the training to sit with a family and describe what dying itself looks like, step by step, before it arrives. I have sat in that chair more times than I can count anymore, not as a nurse, not as a doctor, as a neighbor, a friend, a wife, and now, at 92, simply as someone who has outlived a great many people she loved. In a small community where we still gather at each other's bedsides rather than leaving that entirely to strangers in a building we rarely visit ourselves. What I want to share with you today are the things I have watched happen again and again in those final weeks, the changes that are almost always simply the body's own way of closing itself down gently, not a crisis to be solved. I am not a medical professional, and everything I describe here matches what hospice researchers have documented and published, which I will point you toward as well. But most families never hear any of it until they are already living through it, frightened, in the middle of the night, wondering if they should call an ambulance for something that was never an emergency at all. My name is Sachiko Yuho. I am 92 years old. I was born in a small village near Ojimi, and I still live in the house my husband and I built together in 1958 in a community where so many of us live into our 90s and beyond. Death is not something we keep at a careful distance. The way I understand it often is in other places. It happens among people we know, in houses down the street, and very often in the room next to the one where the family is still living their ordinary life, cooking dinner, doing laundry, half a house away from someone who is dying peacefully, on their own terms, with people they love nearby. I think that closeness has taught our community something that gets lost when death happens mostly behind hospital doors, quietly, among strangers. It taught us to recognize the process, not to predict the exact hour. Nobody can do that, but to recognize the stage as well, enough that fear does not fill in the gaps where knowledge should be. Most families, I have come to understand, imagine death as a single moment, a line crossed, sudden and total, the way it happens in films. What actually happens in the great majority of cases where someone dies of age or illness rather than suddenly and by accident is a process. It unfolds over weeks, then days, then hours, each stage with its own recognizable pattern. And one of the more sobering pieces of research I've come across, a study of family caregivers of people with dementia, found that over a third of them described themselves as genuinely unprepared for the death of their loved one when it came, not unprepared emotionally, which no one ever fully is, but unprepared in the practical sense of simply not recognizing what they were watching happen in front of them. That same research found those unprepared families carried a measurably higher risk of anxiety, depression, and prolonged, complicated grief afterward compared with families who understood it, even roughly what to expect. I find that finding almost unbearably sad because so much of it seems preventable, not through any medicine, but through a conversation that almost nobody has in time. Let me walk you through what I have seen and what the research confirms, stage by stage, the way I would explain it to my own daughter, because in fact I already have, in the weeks before death. And I want to stress that this stage can last anywhere from a few weeks to a couple of months. There is no fixed clock. The changes are usually quiet ones, easy to miss or easy to misread as depression or simple stubbornness. The person sleeps more, sometimes far more than usual, and becomes harder to rouse fully even when awake. They speak less, not because anything is wrong with their mind necessarily, but because conversation itself takes energy the body has begun rationing elsewhere. They lose interest in things that used to matter to them: visitors, the television, food they once loved. That last one, the loss of appetite, is the change I have watched cause the most unnecessary anguish in families, because it looks, to someone who loves you, exactly like giving up. It is not giving up. Hospice researchers describe this plainly. As the body's systems begin winding down, food and fluid genuinely cannot be processed the way they once were. Eating stops helping, and in the final stage can even cause discomfort, nausea, labored breathing from fluid the body no longer knows how to manage. The body is not choosing to starve itself out of despair. It is simply no longer able to use what it's given, and it is quietly telling you so the only way it can. I remember sitting with my friend Michiko's daughter 3 summers ago. While Michiko refused the rice porridge her daughter had made with such love and effort, her daughter was in tears in the kitchen, certain her mother was choosing to die faster by refusing to eat, feeling, I think, that she had somehow failed at the one thing a daughter should be able to do. I told her what I am telling you now. Her mother's body had simply stopped asking for food, the way a fire stops asking for wood once it has already burned down to embers. It was not a rejection of her daughter's love. It was her mother's body doing exactly what dying bodies do. The withdrawal from conversation is harder for most families to sit with than the withdrawal from most families, I think, because it can look so much like someone pulling away from the people they love at exactly the moment those people most want to hold on. My neighbor Toshio spent nearly 6 weeks visiting his father every single afternoon in this stage and told me more than once that the silence felt like a punish, as though his father were somehow angry with him or had already left in every way that mattered, except the medical one. What I told Toshio and what hospice workers have told countless families before me is that this quiet is rarely emotional distance. It takes real energy to hold a conversation, to track another person's words and shape a reply, in a body that is beginning to conserve its resources for the essential work of simply continuing to function will often spend what little it has on breathing and very little on talking. Toshio kept visiting anyway, mostly in silence, sometimes reading the newspaper aloud without expecting a reply. He told me afterward that he was glad he hadn't waited for conversation to return before he kept showing up. What can a family actually do in this stage? Very little needs fixing. And I think that is the hardest part to accept because we want so badly to help in a way that involves doing something. Offer small sips or small bites if the person wants them. And let go entirely of any goal around finishing a plate a few spoonfuls accepted with pleasure. Matters more than a full bowl finished out of obligation to please you. Keep talking to them, even when they seem to be sleeping through it or unable to answer, because hearing is understood to be one of the last senses to fade. And hospice nurses will tell you plainly to act as though your loved one can hear every word, because in all likelihood, for longer than you'd expect, they can. Sit with the silence rather than filling it anxiously. You do not need to entertain someone whose body is conserving its strength. And if you notice yourself, like Toshio, interpreting withdrawal as rejection, it may help simply to say it aloud to someone else who has been through this, so the thought does not sit unspoken and grow heavier than it needs to. In the final days, the pattern shifts again, and this is the stage where I think families most often panic and reach for the telephone, believing something has gone terribly wrong that requires an ambulance, when in fact what they are witnessing is simply the process moving into its next, more visible phase. Breathing changes in a way that alarms almost everyone who has not been warned about it in advance. It may become irregular, with long pauses, sometimes 10, 20, even 30 seconds of no breath at all, followed by a breath that seems almost too deep, too sudden. There may be a wet, rattling sound with each breath, caused by fluid the body can no longer clear from the throat, sometimes called, quite bluntly, the death rattle. I want to tell you plainly, because I know how frightening this sounds to hear and how much more frightening it is to actually witness. Hospice professionals are consistent in saying this sound, distressing as it is to hear, does not appear to cause the dying person pain or distress themselves. It sounds far worse to the people in the room than it feels to the person making it. The skin changes too, hands and feet, and eventually the arms and legs grow cool to the touch as circulation quietly withdraws toward the body's core, prioritizing the heart and brain over the extremities. The skin may develop a mottled, blotchy appearance, patches of purple-red against paler skin, most often first at the knees, then spreading. A landmark study published in 2015 examined dying patients closely enough to identify 8 specific physical signs that, when they appeared, predicted death within 3 days with real statistical reliability Among them, a weakening pulse at the wrist, a particular droop to the crease beside the nose, an inability to fully close the eyelids, and pupils that no longer reacted normally to light. I mentioned this not so a family should sit there checking a list like a clinician, but so that if you notice these things happening, you understand you are not imagining decline that isn't there. You are recognizing a real, well-documented pattern, one your own eyes are perfectly capable of seeing, whether or not anyone has explained it to you beforehand. What can a family do in this stage? Turn and reposition the person gently every so often to ease stiffness and prevent pressure sores, pausing if you see any sign of discomfort. Keep them warm with ordinary blankets, never a heating pad or electric blanket. Since skin in this state is more fragile, than it appears. If the breathing sounds wet and rattling, propping the head slightly and turning the person onto their side can sometimes ease it. And hospice teams can often provide medication that reduces the sound further if it becomes distressing to the family, even though it is not believed to be distressing to the person themselves. It is worth asking about this directly, since not every family thinks to. Long pauses in breathing are, on their own, one of the harder things to sit through calmly. And I want to say plainly what I have learned from watching this many times now: counting the seconds, waiting to see if the next breath will come, is an almost universal instinct, and an almost universally exhausting one. It rarely helps to fix your attention on the clock. It helps more, I think, to keep your hand where the person can feel it and your voice, low and steady, so that whatever awareness remains meets warmth rather than tension in the room. Some families find it useful in these final days to think in terms of small, concrete tasks, rather than one large, overwhelming vigil dampening the lips with a moistened swab if the mouth looks dry, since thirst itself is understood to fade even as the mouth may look uncomfortable. Dimming harsh lights, since eyes in this stage are often more sensitive, keeping the room quiet enough that a lowered voice can still be heard. None of these tasks changes the outcome. What they do, I have noticed, is give a family something honest and useful to do with their hands and their attention, rather than sitting helplessly with nothing but fear to occupy them. And above all, in my experience, simply being present matters more than doing anything at all. I have watched families spend a dying person's final days searching desperately for some intervention, some fix, when what was actually needed from them was simply their hand and their voice and their willingness to sit still. Now, I want to tell you about the part of this that surprises almost every family. The part that even experienced hospice nurses describe as one of the strangest and most moving things they witness in their work, sometimes in the final days or even the final hours. A person who has been unresponsive or confused or lost for months to advanced dementia suddenly becomes clear. They recognize a face they haven't recognized in a year. They speak in full, coherent sentences after months of silence. They ask for something specific, a song, a food, a person by name, with a clarity that seems to come from nowhere. Researchers call this terminal lucidity, and I want to be honest with you about how little is truly understood about why it happens, because I think honesty matters more here than a tidy explanation. Studying it is genuinely difficult, and much of what's published so far comes from surveys of family members describing what they witnessed rather than controlled clinical research, so the numbers you'll see vary widely depending on how and whom researchers ask. What does seem consistent across the case studies that do exist is that these episodes are usually brief seconds to minutes, occasionally longer, and that they tend to cluster in the final days or hours of life, though not always. One frequently cited account describes an elderly woman, silent and unresponsive for weeks, who suddenly sat up, looked directly at her son, recited a verse from memory, then lay back down, never spoke again, and died about a month later. It is, by any account, one of the more genuinely mysterious things that happens near the end of a life, and researchers at institutions, including the National Institutes of Health, have only recently begun studying it seriously. I raise this because I have watched it do real harm to families who were not warned it might happen. A moment of sudden clarity after months of decline can feel like a miracle, proof that recovery is finally beginning. Families call other relatives, tell them to come quickly, share the good news, and then, often within hours or days, the person is gone, and the family is left not only grieving but confused and, sometimes, feeling foolish or betrayed by a hope Nobody warned them not to trust completely. I do not say this to strip the moment of its beauty. I have watched it, and it is beautiful. Often the last real conversation a family has with someone they love. I say it so that if it happens to you, you can hold both truths at once. This may be a real, precious gift of connection, and it may also be a sign. Not that the end is further away, but that it is closer. I want to be honest about the limits of everything I've told you today, because I think false certainty would be its own kind of disservice. Not every person experiences every sign I've described, and the order and timing vary enormously from person to person, and especially from illness to illness. Someone dying of heart failure follows a different pattern than someone dying of cancer, which follows a different pattern again than someone with advanced dementia. None of what I've described here should be used to guess an exact day or hour. Even experienced hospice teams, watching closely, generally speak in ranges of days rather than precise predictions, and can and do get even those ranges wrong. And nothing here replaces the judgment of an actual hospice or medical team who can see things in a particular patient that no general description ever could. If you are caring for someone at the end of life, please stay in close contact with their care team and call them, not only an emergency line when something changes and you're unsure what it means. I've wondered over the years why so few people are given this information calmly, in advance, rather than learning it in a panic in the middle of the worst nights of their lives. I don't believe anyone is hiding it from families deliberately. I think the honest explanation is simpler and, in its own way, sadder. Our medical systems are built, appropriately, around treating illness and prolonging life. And the conversation about what happens when treatment is no longer the goal often gets pushed later, and sometimes until there's almost no time left to have it properly. Doctors are rarely trained specifically in how to describe this process to families, and many find the conversation as difficult to initiate as families find it to ask for. Researchers who studied this directly have found the barriers run in both direction, which I think is important to say honestly rather than placing the difficulty entirely on one side. Physicians, in their own surveys, most often cite simply not having enough time in an appointment built for other things, along with genuine uncertainty about exactly how a particular illness will unfold, which makes some reluctant to speak plainly about a timeline they cannot guarantee it. But patients and families carry their own share of the avoidance, too. In one survey of people with serious illness, well over half said they would actually prefer not to discuss their prognosis with their doctor at all. And those who felt this way tended to hold a more hopeful view of how much time remained. In other words, the silence is not only handed down from above, it is very often something both sides quietly agree to, each hoping the other will bring it up first until neither one does. And the conversation simply never happens. Research on caregiver preparedness backs up why this matters plainly. Families who receive this kind of information in advance report significantly less anxiety and depression afterward than those who don't. And yet the conversation itself remains one of the most commonly skipped parts of a person's final care. If someone you love is approaching the end of their life, or if you simply want to be less afraid of a day that comes for all of us, eventually, here is what I would gently suggest. Ask their doctor or hospice team directly what to expect, specifically, rather than waiting for the information to arrive on its own. Most care teams are glad to explain this when asked plainly, even if they rarely volunteer it unprompted. Write down or remember the general stages I've described today, not as a countdown, but as a map that tells you when you're on familiar ground rather than in an emergency. Keep talking to your loved one at every stage on the assumption that they can hear you, because the evidence suggests that for longer than seems possible, they often can. And if a moment of sudden clarity arrives, let yourself receive it as the gift it is, while also gently preparing your heart and, if possible, the rest of your family for what it may also mean. None of this makes losing someone easier, not really. I don't think anything fully does. But I have watched again and again in this small community where death has never been kept at arm's length from us, that understanding what is happening seems to leave people steadier afterward than not understanding does. Fear fills every gap that knowledge doesn't occupy first. I sat with my own mother through her final days, many years ago now, before I understood any of what I've told you today. I did not know then that her breathing would change the way it did, or that her hands would grow cold while her heart kept beating for hours longer than I expected, or that the silence in the room did not mean she couldn't hear me. I have wished, more times than I can count, that someone had simply sat me down beforehand and told me plainly and gently what I was about to watch happen. I am trying, all these years later, to be that person for you. If you are walking through this right now with someone you love, I am deeply sorry, and I hope something in what I've shared today makes even 1 hour of it a little less frightening. If you are simply here out of curiosity or to prepare for a day you hope is still far off, I hope this stays with you until you need it, the way I wish someone had once given it to me. Tell me, if you would like, whether any of this matched something you've witnessed yourself. I read what people share, and I know many of you carry stories like Michiko's daughters, stories you may never have had the chance to make sense of until now. Next time, I would like to talk about something gentler, the small, specific things my community actually says and does at a deathbed. The words we use, the songs we sometimes sing, and why I've come to believe that presence matters far more than any of us are usually told. Thank you for sitting with me this morning.